Altman's JOWBR lecture. Few housekeeping rules. Please hold your questions till the end and to make sure that your phones are turned on silence. I am Ann Madden-Hellman from Charleston, South Carolina, and as I was asked years ago at a convention, are there Jews in Charleston? Yes, there are Jews all over South Carolina. I was very fortunate to have met Nolan Altman 8 years ago in Chicago. It was then that he convinced me to send to JOWBR the cemetery listings that I had on the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina's website. The site was a great feeling to know that you were doing something that would help others and their families and assure that no one is forgotten. Nolan's love and dedication of JOWBR, the Holocaust Memorial Database, and the Memorial Plaque Project is a driving force behind getting additional volunteers and making sure that these projects are a success that they are today. Nolan Altman was bit by the genealogy bug when he was inspired to write his family history in 1996 in memory of his mother. After making use of the valuable information on JewishGen, he volunteered to do data entry on various projects. In time, he was asked to become the coordinator of JewishGen's Holocaust database and subsequently the coordinator for the JOWBR, JewishGen's online worldwide burial registry project. Nolan works with volunteers from around the world, helping to grow the databases for the benefit of family members and researchers. Nolan currently holds the position of JewishGen's Vice President for Data Acquisition and will focus on the growing JOWBR, Holocaust databases, and JewishGen's new Memorial Plaque Project. Nolan has made various presentations and conducted computer workshops at the IAJGS, International Association of Jewish Genealogy Societies, annual conferences in Boston, Washington, D.C., Paris, New York City, Chicago, Salt Lake City, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. He continues to present his How to Document and Research Your Family History seminar to adult and continuing education classes, as well as university Holocaust and European history classes. He has had articles published in Avatano, New Dorot, Stambaum, Chernow, and the FEE-FHS Journal. He is currently on the board of the International Association of the Jewish Genealogical Societies, IAJGS, and was president of JGSLI, Jewish Genealogy Society of Long Island, where he coordinates their yearbook, cemetery, and memorial plaque projects. Nolan is also a member of the JGS of New York. May I present Nolan Altman.
Thank you. Thank you, Ann, and this is an example of one of our valued volunteers, that we could not be as successful as we are without such people like Ann, so thank you very much. And as you can see, my name is Nolan, and I'm a genealogist. And like you, when I first started out, I knew nothing. I literally come from a part of my family tree where my father is the youngest sibling by far. I didn't know my uncles, my cousins were all much older than me. I had no interaction. So everything that I was starting to go through was new to me. And when I started out, I did what all of you probably did, which was to do an oral history. And I sat down and I talked to my father, who was the only one of his siblings born in the United States, and I asked him about his parents, which he certainly could tell me about, because they came here. And I said, tell me something about your Altman grandparents. Nothing. Okay, so I chalked it up to the fact that he was a boy, he was born here, he never asked the questions. I went to my Aunt Molly, who was his next sibling, but much older, was born in Poland, and I said, Aunt Molly, can you tell me something about your Altman grandparents? And she knew nothing. And so right at the start, I had hit this block, right, this brick wall, and I couldn't get back any further than the Altmans that were in the United States until I found about naming conventions. And Jewish genealogy has so many challenges, real challenges. We know names were changed, spellings are changed, countries are changed, records have been destroyed and lost. But Jewish genealogy has one advantage that almost no other cultural group has, and that is patronymic naming. Incredibly important. So what is patronymic naming? Let me put you back into grade school. Remember the explorer Eric the Red? He had a son named Leif. We know him better as Leif Erikson. Leif had a son named Thorkel. He was known as Thorkel Leifson, right? None of these are surnames. None of these are family names. These are all patronymic names. They're being named after the father. What we've done here is we've linked together 3 generations just by using their patronymic names. Hebrew names follow the same. So in Hebrew names, we have 4 parts. There's a given name, son of or daughter of indication, the father's name, father's given name, and then whether or not you are a Kohen or a Levi. Kohen is a descendant of Moses' brother Aaron, the very first high priest, or whether you're from the tribe of Levi, which is the priestly tribe at all. So if I take Aaron as an example, here's Aaron in Hebrew. It would be more like Aharon, transliterated, and then Aaron in English. Then son of would be Ben, or Bear, you might see, and his father's name was Amram, and he was a Kohen, so at the end of his name, it would say Ha-Kohen. And so Aaron's Hebrew name would be Aharon ben Amram Ha-Kohen. Well, in my family, if I were to take me, my name is Noach ben Munish. My father's name is Munish ben Noach. His father's name is Noach ben Munish. Start to see a pattern, right? Names tend to repeat in families, especially if you know the difference between Ashkenazic and Sephardic, right? Ashkenazic Jews tend to name children in memory of somebody. Sephardic name people in honor of somebody who's living, which right there gives you a clue as to who you're being named after or when somebody else might have been around. But we've got the same thing about linking generations, which is so important. How do people get their last names? Well, these are some of the ways. Physical characteristics, places where they may have been born or where they got the name originally, or occupational names are used for surnames. Reznik means butcher in Polish. Reznicki, and I have to say this very carefully, is a son of a butcher, okay? Or Reznicki just makes it sound a little easier to drop the K. So your surname could be an occupational surname, which could give you a hint as to what your relatives or your ancestors did at the time they took that name. There was a miniseries on TV a while ago. It was about a family named the Wheelers. They lived in a town called Wheeler, and guess what they did? They made Conestoga wagon wheels. So it was a prominent enough family that they named the town after them, and it was named for an occupation. And you get to tie all those together with their names. And then ethnic differences, like I mentioned with Jewish, knowing between Ashkenazi and Sephardic, but you'll find that all cultures have some set of rules, not always followed 100%, but who the first son is named after, who the first daughter is named after, and the second one and the third one. And I was mentioning before, my father's name was Morris. He had 3 first cousins with the name Morris. I thought this is the most uncreative family in the world. Couldn't they come up with any other name? And the reason was all of these Morrises were named after somebody who passed away who was, an ancestor of that family. The earliest family group in my tree, there is no Morris. Why? Because that person was still alive. So it gave me an indication as to when this person had passed away. You may never think of surnames the same way again. Think of maybe even your surname comes from a patronymic name. But if you think about all the names that are out there, think about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Abram's son, Isaac's son, Jacob's son. Shorten it, Abram's, Isaac's, Jacob's. Those are all from patronymic names. The Welsh examples I always found very interesting. They would have a prefix, ap, ab or up in front of the father's name. So if your father's name was Richard, you would be known as Apritchard. And then over time, the A was dropped, and it became Pritchard. Pritchard is a son of Richard. Abowen is the son of Owen, right? And we've got Upjohn is the son of John. Some of the Romance languages, you had a choice. So if you take France, for instance, de Paul means you came from Paul, right? Son or daughter of Paul. Or Morissette, like meaning the little Morris, okay? So you'll find that almost all cultures have some series of patronymic naming, because if you think about the beginnings in small clusters of people, you didn't need a second name. You didn't need a family name until the population started to grow. If you were in Poland and your father's name was Abram, the boy in the family would be named Abramowitz. The girl in the family would be known as Abramovna. Two children sitting in the same household being referred to by the father's name, patronymic naming. Here's some examples of occupational surnames. Fleischer is a butcher in German, Molina is a miller in Spanish, Schmidt is a blacksmith or some kind of a smith, and Calderon is a maker of pots, right? So again, it could be an indication as what your family did when they took that name. Here are some based on physical characteristics. Altman, literally, Altman means old man in German. So the first Altman could have been an elderly person, or as I like to think of it, maybe it was just a sign of respect, and that's how they took that name. Vaughan is smaller or younger in Welsh, Longfellow is a tall man, and Rossi or Rossini is a ruddy or a red-headed person. Might be interesting to do an analysis of that line and see whether or not those people still have red hair or ruddy complexions. And then there are some suffixes that you may find on names that might help. Not many in this case are from Hebrew names or Jewish names, but they might give an indication of where a person came from, a place, an area, a town, a creek, a river, something like that. So do you think that anybody uses this anymore in the 21st century, patronymic naming? There's actually one place. Russians have patronymic names, but they also have surnames and family names. But there's one other place. When I was, both of my daughters played travel soccer, and so I was really into travel soccer, and I was watching the women's national team. And there was a game that was on, it was called a friendly, and before the game they put up a picture of the playing field, and they have all the names of the players and their positions. And I'm looking at the names, I'm going, these are really strange names. And so in Iceland, they still use patronymic names. Take a look at the names, if you can read them. You've got Hannesdottir, Johannesdottir, Magnusdottir, Larsdottir, Jansdottir, Thorstensdottir, Gunnarsdottir. All of these women are being referred to based on their father's name. Well, you may say, what about the men that play there? Here's the men's roster. Ara's son, Siver's son, Gunnar's son, Sigurd's son, Stein's son. Two children sitting in the same household, both of them being referred to by the father's name, not having a family name, okay? Iceland is a pretty amazing place. Last summer, I went there on vacation. It's an amazing place. And of the 300 some odd thousand people that live in Iceland, most of them live in the Reykjavik area. And so we were taking a walk from the hotel to the National Museum, and this was not planned. I passed a cemetery. And in the front row of that cemetery was this stone, right? You got a Hebrew star, a Jewish star, Jan Bjarni Peterson, Ingeborg Steingrim's daughter. You would never know that these people were married to each other because they don't have a family name, a shared family name. You're born with that name and you carry it all the way through your life. Now, as I mentioned, there's a limited population in Iceland. And Iceland itself wasn't populated until the very early 1900s, late 1890s. There were no indigenous people in Iceland. So everybody in Iceland is somehow related. So now you think, well, what if you were out there and you're dating and you're trying to find the love of your life and you know all these people are somehow related to you? How do you know who you're dating? And how do you know how close of a relative they are to you? Well, believe it or not, they have an app for that. somebody was clever enough, they have all the genealogies of the family homesteads and farmsteads, and they made a database, and they put them into these tables, and they plugged it into an app that goes on your phone, and the idea is when you meet somebody that you're interested in, you bump phones, and you find out how you're related, and the phone will tell you third cousin, second cousin, fifth cousin. And so the idea is that you bump phones before you, well, you get the idea, right? And it's called an incest app. Another way of getting names, legacy names. Even if you know nothing about the NBA, the National Basketball Association, if I told you that there was a team named the Jazz, what city do you think that they would be from? New Orleans, right? New Orleans Jazz. So would you be surprised to know that the Jazz plays in Utah, right? Could you think of two cities that are diametrically opposed, Salt Lake City and New Orleans? So how do they get this name, the Jazz? Well, the reason is because the team moved from New Orleans. They used to be the New Orleans Jazz. And for whatever reason, I have no idea, they've never decided to change the name. So they've kept it. Well, there are surnames that are like that, legacy names. So if you hear a name like Berliner or Moskowitz or Warshawski, that could give you an indication maybe where those people came from, right? A Berliner is someone from Berlin, Moskowitz is from Moscow, Warshawski from Warsaw. So is everybody who's a Warshawski, for instance, from Warsaw? Well, probably not, because everybody in Warsaw is a Warshawski. But if you were from Warsaw and you moved to some other smaller town, and then you were going to take a surname, they might refer to you, that's the guy from Warsaw, that's Warshawski. And that's how you might have gotten that name. So another way of potentially having a clue to where a surname and where your ancestors came from. So I did all the things that I told you about, and at this time you might, hopefully you're saying, well, this is all really interesting, but what does any of this have to do with burial records and JOWBR? Where do you find this information? The best way to find this information is on a headstone, especially when you're talking about first or second generation into this country. They all knew, and the people who gave the information knew their Hebrew names. And you can find them on the stones themselves. So these are my paternal grandparents. My grandmother, her Hebrew name is Cyril bat Natanuta. So now I have her father's name. And my grandfather, Nathan, is Noach ben Munish. And those two names were what I needed to get back into European records, because they never came here, and now I at least have names of people, Hebrew names, for descendants I knew nothing about. And where do you find all of this information? JewishGen, right? www.jewishgen.org is where you can find our online burial database. It's under the database tab. As you scroll down, you'll see it says Burial Register JOWBR. And now I'll tell you a little bit about the database itself. It stands for JewishGen's Online Worldwide Burial Registry, which is a mouthful, which is why we call it JOWBR. It's really three databases combined. It's a database of burial records, individuals' records. It's a database of photos. If we have a photo of a headstone, it'll be linked to the record. And it's a database of information on the cemeteries in which those people are buried, okay? It includes Jewish burials all over the world, whether it's a Jewish cemetery, a section in a non-Jewish cemetery, even a non-denominational cemetery. If we know that those are Jewish burials, we want to include them. We don't decide whether or not they're Jewish or not based on their name. There are lots of examples of names where you think that they might be Jewish, but they're not, or they're not names that you would associate with being Jewish, and they are. So if you see a Hebrew star, a Jewish star, or you see the Hebrew inscription of a name, that would be an indication, and we would want to include that. Currently, JOWBR has over 2.9 million records. Hopefully we'll break through the 3 million mark this year. We update it semi-annually. We just did an update in June, so the next one will be at the calendar year end. We've got over 500,000 photos in the database, 6,400 cemeteries and cemetery sections. When I say cemetery sections, I'm referring to those large cemeteries that are divided up into Landsmannschaft sections, right? A Landsmannschaft section might be an area that was purchased by the people who came from a certain town in Europe. And so they bought an area, they created a society, and then they sold the plots out. If I know that there's an area like that for a town that I am interested in, I want to know who's buried in that section. Those could be relatives of mine or extended family members or whatever. So it's really interesting to find out if you've got somebody in a Landsmannschaft section that matches up to a town name that you're looking for. There are also Landsmannschaft sections for synagogues and social organizations, so they don't necessarily have to be town names. We have records from 123 countries. You would expect the United States and Canada and North America. You'd expect Poland and Russia and Germany. But the more I did this, the less surprised I was to find out there were Jews all over the world. Wherever there was a Jewish population, at some point in time, there would be Jewish burials. And typically, burials were done separate from the rest of the community, either because they had to be or because they wanted them to be. But we found burials in all of these different places: China, Egypt, India, Kenya, Sri Lanka, Zambia, Mongolia, Eritrea. And so the names continue to grow. Now, I'll also tell you that we've gotten access to lists of veterans who died, servicemen, especially British servicemen who died during the war overseas. And there are veteran cemeteries all over the world. So there might be 2 or 3 Jewish individuals buried in a country, in a far-off country, wherever they were fighting. What JOWBR is not, okay, it's not a listing of all the cemeteries in the world, but there is such a spot. The IAJGS has something called their cemetery project. Their goal is not individual burial records, but to list all of the places where there are Jewish burials. So if you've got a town of interest, you can put in and search for that town and find out, based on whatever we know, what's in that town, what kind of cemeteries there are. There's other information in there too: synagogues, social groups, other helpful information. But try iajgs.org/cemetery, and you'll see the names of all the cemeteries. JOWBR is also not a listing of other websites. I know that there are other databases out there, but the idea of JOWBR, it's one centralized database. You do a search by a name or a search by a town, and you'll get records, not a list of 50 other places that you can go to and plug in names. So if you're looking for a list of websites, that's not really what we have. And it's also not a cemetery restoration project, although we do work with groups that do cemetery restorations, and we hopefully will get the records once they put stones back up or clean them up and get them translated and put them online. Where does the information come from? Who does all of this? Well, most of it actually comes from individuals like you. People who go out there, they want to make the information about an ancestor permanent. And so we require that we add full cemeteries or full cemetery sections. And so when I wanted to get my grandparents in the database, I did the section that they're in, and I uploaded the entire section. So it's coming from individuals. In some cases, we have cemetery administrators who are amenable to helping us, and they'll give us the data. Genealogical societies, a lot of them have cemetery committees where they'll go out and they'll do the photographing and the indexing, and they'll send in the information. Jewish historical societies, such as ANS. So there are other sources, other groups that do this as group projects. Also, some of the synagogues have their own sections, as I mentioned, and they will give us information, or the Chevra Kadisha, that's the burial society. And then there are some people who go on vacation back to their ancestral towns. They can't read the languages, maybe that are on the stone. Maybe the stones are all in Hebrew or Romanian or Cyrillic or something like that. But they'll take pictures of all the stones and send them to us, and we have volunteers who will take those pictures and create the templates that we use to upload to the database. So even if you can't read something, send us the information and we'll put it on, but not individual family records. Where does the information come from? The information that's in the database should be the same as what's on the headstone. In other words, what we're trying to do is we're putting you in the same position you would be in if you physically went and visited the cemetery. Okay? We're not going to make any kind of editorial decisions on whether the inscriptions are right or wrong, whether something is left off. This is what you would find if you were there. Now, do whatever research you want to do that you think is appropriate and take it from there. In some cases, the cemeteries don't exist anymore, unfortunately. And we think of Eastern Europe as the place where a lot of them are overgrown or they were destroyed during World War II. We might have a cemetery register, which we would use as the base information, even though the stones don't exist. But I have to tell you that it's not just Eastern Europe anymore. There are plenty of places, even in the United States, where in large metropolitan areas, there are cemeteries that are totally overgrown, and nobody is keeping track of them, and nobody is maintaining them, and all of that information is subject to being lost. Published historical information, there are academics that actually do surveys and histories of towns, and part of that would be a listing of all of the family members, and we might use that to add into our database. And then finally, there are a couple of places, in the US especially, where there might be only one Jewish funeral home. And although we may not have the records from the cemeteries, we might have the records from the funeral home, and we would add that to the database. All right, so let me give you an example of how you would actually get into this. I mentioned that on the homepage, the Jewish Gen homepage, you scroll down to Burial Registry, and that'll get you to the Jewish Gen homepage. So the first question you might have is, well, how do I know if the cemetery I'm interested in is already in your database? So here you've got the contents of the database, and if you click on that, you get a cemetery inventory. This lists all the cemeteries and cemetery sections that we have in JOWBR. It's done geographically. Every time you see a folder, that means you can click on it and there's more information under it, sub-information. So here you see everything is arranged alphabetically by country. If you were to click on a country like Poland, it would come down to different regions within that country, and these are the standard Jewish Gen regions that they use. You see they're all folders, so if I click on a folder again, I'll get the individual towns in that section, that region that we have cemetery records for. It also tells you the date that the information went online, so you can tell how recent it is, and it tells you how many records there are for that cemetery. If there's more than one cemetery in a town, all of the individual cemeteries will be listed under the city name. In the United States, the regions are the states. In Canada, the regions are the provinces. Here's an example of New York, all the cities in New York, and then under Pine Lawn is one of these immense mega cemeteries on Long Island. And so here you can see all the individual sections that are in the JOWBR database, and that's very helpful. Here in Washington, I put up the Washington cemeteries that are listed, so you can see the cities, and then under that, the actual names. Another area that we found was very helpful was from the United States Veterans Administration. We got records of all the veterans in the national cemeteries and the records of those veterans that were buried in non-national or state cemeteries but had asked for a veterans plaque, and I'll show you that in a minute. All right, so now going back to that home page, if you are interested in submitting information, I've got something here that says click on here for more information, and you've got all the information written out about how to submit records to JOWBR. And if you're trying to get records from a cemetery or from a group that maybe doesn't know anything about it, I put together a document called Why Submit Records to JOWBR, and the whole point of this was to try to explain to non-genealogists why this information is so important to us. So it talks about patronymic naming. It talks about the permanence of the records. It even talks about this being a mitzvah, right? Honor thy mother and thy father. And so this is a way of doing that as well. And knowing that I'm also dealing with business people, it is a business to run a cemetery, I also told them this is a potential way that they can increase their revenue flow, because some cemeteries charge for photos. Sometimes people know that there's an extra plot there. Sometimes there's no perpetual care, and they might be able to get additional money by making contacts with those ancestors. Now, believe it or not, and I know it doesn't affect anybody sitting in here, some people don't like to read directions. Right? Nobody here. Okay. So for those people, what I did was I put together a bunch of screencasts. And all these are short 2 to 4 minute little videos that you can watch and you can listen to me explain exactly how to fill out the Excel template. And there are a couple of videos that tell you exactly how to do a search and what JOWBR is. And so you can show that to an administrator or your temple group or whoever it is that you're trying to help you enlist in doing the project. So let's do an actual search. I'll give you an idea of what you can find. So if I wanted to do a search for my grandfather, Nathan Altman, the typical Jewish Gen drop-down menus exist in JOWBR, and you can do multiple variable searches within here. So I can do a surname and a town, or a surname and a given name, or a surname, a given name, and a town. Obviously, the more variables I use, the more restrictive my results are going to be. So start with as many as you want, and then loosen it up to see whether maybe there's something else in there. But in this case, I'm putting in a surname as Altman, and I'm putting down it's exactly, as opposed to a sound alike or starts with, and these, again, these are the typical Jewish Gen variables. And I'm also going to put in the given name of the deceased, but I could do given name of spouse or father or mother. As long as that information is in the database, you can get results. If that's not in there, then nothing is going to come back. So I'm going to do a search for Nathan Altman, and what I get back is all the Nathan Altmans that are in the database. And so I see that there are 4 states in the United States where there are Nathan Altmans, 1 each in Connecticut, Florida, Indiana, 4 in New York, okay? Knowing that my grandparents lived in New York, I will click on List 4 Records, and I'll get a little more information about the Nathan Altmans that are in the database. So you've got a date of death and a date of birth, and then we can view the full burial record, all the information for each one of these. If you look at this and you can tell which one you're looking for, that's great. If not, you'll look at each individual one and see whether it makes sense. So if I'm looking for my grandfather and I look at the first one and I see that this person died at 11 months, there's a good chance that that's not going to be my grandfather, right? And so, it reminds me of the story of the really sad story of the individual who all 4 of his grandparents died in infancy. It's very, very sad. It's kind of like my brother being an only child, but, it just doesn't work. So anyway, you can see on the top of each one of these it says view the full record. I can view the full burial record, and in here we've got the name, Nathan Altman, and under that are all the surnames that are associated. So you can see Steinberg, Rosenwein, and Altman, and I'll show you where those come from. We've got the place of birth, the place of death, the date of birth, the date of death, Hebrew name. All of these are the potential fields where you can put information into. The more information you know, that's fine. If you're putting information in here that's not coming from the stone, you really should probably add a comment that says this information is coming from someplace else, where it's coming from. Otherwise, the person looking at a photo isn't going to have any clue as to how you figured this out. So if you see under spouse, we've got Sadie Steinberg. So that's his spouse's maiden name. And under his mother, you've got Zlata Rosenwein. That's his mother's maiden name. And so if you go back up to the top where it said name, you see those 3 names, Steinberg, Rosenwein, and Altman. If I had searched on any one of those names, I would have gotten this record. So we're linking together all these members of the family as well, which is a big, big help. Because maybe you know a woman's name or a husband's name and you don't know the other names. And this could show this could turn something up. On the bottom right, it's got the cemetery name. If you click on that, you get the basic information about the cemetery. This is a very flexible system. I can add anything into that bottom block called cemetery description. So I can add the names of the people if they want credit for taking the photos, doing the indexing, the society names. I can put the history of the town in there, overview photos of the cemetery. In this one, I added the gates. When you're going into the cemetery, they've got the names of all the officers of the section. So I put those photos in there because not all those people are actually buried in that section for whatever reason. So this is another way that you can add information, or you could refer people to another site. I tell other people, I'm not trying to duplicate what you have. I'm not trying to take away what you have. If you give us the basic information, surname, date of birth, date of death, I'll be more than happy to refer them to your site for more information. But at least now everybody could find it in a centralized database. And that's really our goal. So we're very flexible on what you can put in that block. So now I can tell you that my name is Noach ben Munish, ben Noach, ben Munish, ben to be determined. Right? So let me give you a practical example of what you can do with this. This was something that was posted on the Jewish Gen Digest back in 2010, and this individual is in Israel, but he was looking for somebody to take a picture and get some information for Adolf Wolkowski in the cemetery. And he had the actual row and section and plot number. So this was on the way to where I was working, and I stopped off at the cemetery. But instead of just taking his information, I went into the cemetery office. And I said, do you have information on an Adolf Wolkowski? And they looked it up and they found it, and they gave me Adolf, who also his name is Aaron Wolkowski, and they gave me the information, which was the same information he had. But before I left, I said, do you have any other Wolkowskis in that section? And they said, yes. So I said, okay, please give me that information too. Then I said, well, do you have any other Wolkowskis in the cemetery? And they said, yes. I said, okay, please give me that information as well. So I went out, and the first step was to go find Adolph's stone, and I did. And it was with his name Aaron, the stone on the left. And I don't know if you can tell, but the top of the stone looks like it's a tree that's falling, that's bending over and breaking. I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But it's got a picture of him on the stone. It's got his Hebrew name at the top. It's Aharon ben Chaim. But at the bottom, it says Aharon ben Chaim Leib HaLevi. So that's Aaron, son of Chaim Leib, and he's a Levi, right? So I've got his full Hebrew name on the bottom of that stone. So let's keep that in mind, and that his name was Aaron. Then I went to find the other stone, and it turns out it was his wife's stone, Esther Wolkowski. I've got her Hebrew name, Esther Bat Yitzchak, so now I got her name. It's got a picture of her. This was fantastic information for the researcher. Never thought he was going to end up getting pictures from getting cemetery information. So then I went to the other section that had Wolkowski names, and I found this big stone with these 4 surnames, Wolkowski, Nadell, Walker, and Goldman. And I went out to look for the Wolkowski stones. And, as I'm there, I'm reading all the Hebrew names, trying to see whether or not there's something that links these family names together. And so we've got Dorothy Goldman, whose Hebrew name is Devorah Bat Aharon HaLevi. Jack Walker, Yaakov ben Aharon HaLevi. Joseph Wolkowski, Yaakov ben Aharon HaLevi. And Ray Nadell, Ruchel Bat Adolf. Okay, they took the name Adolf and they put it into Hebrew characters. But what I'm looking at are siblings. All of these are the children of Aaron Wolkowski, Aharon HaLevi. How would you ever know that, right? This was an incredible find for the researcher, because not only did one of the men change their name from Wolkowski to Walker, but you've got 2 women who married, and now he's got their married names. You know how difficult it is to find maiden names once a woman gets married. Here's another great way to potentially finding, by making all of these links. So just with this one visit to the cemetery and looking at those stones, I was able to put together a 3-generational chart of these Wolkowskis families. What I want to tell you now is really some of the things that I see as I'm going around the cemetery, some of the symbols that you might find on headstones. And some of the common ones are candelabras on women's stones, Jewish stars on men's stones. Some of them are incredibly ornate. I know from walking around in some of the New York City area cemeteries, especially the ones from the 40s, the 30s, the 50s, these are the works of craftsmen. And these are works of art, in terms of these engravings. So notice them, take a minute and see them for what they are. How many of you recognize this gentleman? Leonard Nimoy. What is Leonard Nimoy doing? He's giving you one of these, right? Do you know what this is? It's the sign of the Kohen. So what does that have to do with Leonard Nimoy? So Leonard Nimoy, who just recently passed away, was Jewish. And he was doing one of the first scenes with, William Shatner, who's also Jewish, right? And the 2 of them got together at the end, and Nimoy said, at the end of this conversation, I need to do something that we break off. So Shatner said something like, well, we can shake hands and leave. And Nimoy said, no, I can't shake hands with you. You're a human, you know, that's not right. So he said, well, what should I do? What do you want? He says, I'm going to give you one of these. Now, Leonard Nimoy knew what he was doing because he was influenced from going to the high holiday ceremonies with his grandfather. And Shatner knew what he was doing because he was also Jewish. And they said if Gene Roddenberry ever had any idea what these two guys were doing, you know, they never would have left you do it. But this is the sign of the Kohen. And you will see that sign on a lot of headstones where the name, the Hebrew name, will also say at the end, HaKohen. And not everybody that is a Cohen is a Cohen, is a Kohen. Not everybody who's a Kohen is a Cohen, but you will see these markings as you go through the cemetery. This was very odd because how do you know you're a Kohen? Well, the way you know is your father tells you. It goes from father to son to son to son to son. Women are not Kohens, and yet this was a woman's marker, and you could see there's the sign of the Kohen on that. So it must have been her father was a Kohen. These are the sign of the tribe of Levi. Levi is the priestly tribe. The priest would take the water pitchers and clean the hands, wash the hands for the high priest. And so you'll typically see some kind of a water pitcher at the top. And in the names, the Hebrew names, it'll say Ha-Levi. Young adults. And young adults typically are in teens or 20s, maybe 30s. Remember the picture I showed you before that looked like the tree was falling off? Well, that's what's on the top of the one on the left. And on the right, doesn't it look like a tree where the limbs have been cut off? In other words, this individual was cut down in his prime. And that's the indication. Now, the one I showed you before was somebody who was over 50 years old, and that's kind of unusual. But this basically means somebody who died before their time. And then, unfortunately, you'll also see some infant markers. The infant markers in a lot of cemeteries are in the last couple of rows. They're typically made of stones that are different than the markers for the adults, and because of that, the engravings tend to disappear a lot sooner, so they kind of get washed away. And another reason why we want to get this information as quickly as possible before it's lost. These are veterans markers. Take a look at the first one, Alexander Glucksman. He's a private in Company G, 1st Louisiana Cavalry, CSA. We all know what CSA is? Confederate States of America, right. We've got Max Williams from the Spanish-American War, Abraham Goldfarb, World War I, and then we've got Harvey Satter from World War II. What's interesting about these markers is that it usually tells you the company that the person was in and what wars they served during. So if there's a possibility maybe of getting somebody's personnel file, a veteran's personnel file, here's the information that's going to help you find it. And that's good. You can get a veteran's marker for anybody that was a veteran. Even if you have a family stone, you can get a veteran's marker. But sometimes that causes problems. So here's Abe Weinstein. Here's a family marker on the right. And there's the VA marker on the upper left. And does anybody notice a problem with these markers? They have a different date of death, a different date of birth, right? One of them is off by a year. So again, here's the information. Go do whatever research you need to do to figure out which one of these is wrong, assuming one of them is wrong and not both of them are wrong. But I can't tell you how many times someone will come to me and go, I know this is his date, it's on the stone, right? It's gotta be right, it's on the stone. It's only as good as the person who gives the information and assuming the cutter doesn't make a mistake too, right? Quickly, how to read a Jewish headstone. There's a really fast way to do it, and I'll give that to you, but this way I think you'll appreciate what's on there. So the first thing that you can tell me now, just by looking at the top of the stone, is what? He's a Kohen, right. So now we already know that. The next thing that I want, and that says HaKohen in the name. The next thing, the most important piece of, the Pei and the Nun that you may see at the top of headstones, it means Po Nikbar, here lies. So it's just an abbreviation for that. But the most important piece of information that you want to get is the name of the person. And so what you're looking for is the son of or daughter of indication. So you're looking for the ber or ben for a son or bat for a daughter. And when you find that, the name to the right is going to be the name of the deceased. The name to the left is going to be the name of the father. So in this case, I found the bear, and in front of that it says Tuvia, and after that it says Shrega Feivel HaKohen. And so we can say that this person's Hebrew name is Tuvia ben Shrega Feivish HaKohen. And now I know one generation linked back, and I could use that information. As far as numbers on headstones, Hebrew doesn't have numerals, right? Hebrew uses letters to indicate numbers. So Aleph being the first letter of the alphabet is a 1, Bet being the second is a 2, and you go on until you get to Yud, which is 10, and then there are tens up until 100, and then they add hundreds, right? And so you're using all the letters. So how do you use this in terms of coming up with a number indication? Well, you do addition. So if I want to do 11, 11 is 10 plus 1. So the number for 11, the indication for 11 would be Yud Aleph. 12 would be Yud Bet. And that goes on for a while. Everything is fine and dandy until you get to 15. Because 15 is Yud He, and 16 would be Yud Vav. And the tetragrammaton for the name of God is Yud He Vav He. And we don't want that used in certain ways, and certainly not on a headstone. So what am I going to do to come up with the number 15 if I can't do 10 plus 5? How about 9 plus 6? So 15 is 9 plus 6. 16 is 9 plus 7. And then we'll go back 10 plus 8, 10 plus 9, 20. Clever, right? The Hebrew months, there are 12 months in the year. On a leap year, there's an extra month added. Adar Aleph is added. The Hebrew calendar is a modified lunar calendar. Why? Because there are holidays like the harvest holiday. It has to be at the harvest time. And so there is a calendar to take into account for the changing year by year. And I think there's 7-year cycles, and Steve Morse might do something on the calendar here. But that's the extra month that's added, Adar Aleph. And so if you were to look here, the first thing you'd see the line that says died, which is Naftir. Okay, that's that. And then after that, you're going to actually find the date and the month and the year. And then it's a puzzle. It's putting together the numbers, and here's the month, and here's the year, and you could just work it all out, and you could come up with the actual year. It's interesting. It might be fun the first time, maybe the second time. You're not going to want to do it the third time, and you're not going to want to do it for a whole section. So what you can do is go to Steve Morse's site. He's got on his site something called Deciphering Hebrew Tombstone Dates in a One-Step, and they're just all pull-down menus. And all you've got to do, even if you don't read Hebrew, just recognize the symbols, put them into the chart, and it will tell you the equivalent civil date. Keep in mind, important, the Hebrew day starts at sunset, right? So for every Hebrew date, there are 2 equivalent civil dates. Makes a difference. I've seen on a lot of European stones, it will actually say the date they died, AM or PM, because they want you to have the right Yizkor date. And so that's one of the things just to look out for. And then the last line, you may see these letters, which is just an abbreviation from may his soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. Okay, going back to some of the stones and what I found. Some people will submit to me a spreadsheet, and they'll go, you're not going to believe this, but everybody that I'm related to and everybody in this town are rabbis. And I would say, yeah, you're right, I don't believe it. Why do you think that they're all rabbis? Because there's a resh in front of their name, every one of them. Well, the resh in front of their name just means mister. It's an honorific. And that doesn't mean that they're a rabbi. Some people get very deflated by that, and they don't want to hear that. But that's all it means. So you can see the resh in front of these names, resh tzvi, resh feivel. But if it was a rabbi, it would say harav. And that's what this indication is on the upper left. Harav means the rabbi. This is also a possibility, and it's something to think about. There are stones that do have maiden names on them. So it would be a great, plus to memorialize a woman's maiden name as well as all the other information. Non-religious symbols tell you something about the person. We do this research, we get this data, we put it in spreadsheets, we put it in a tree. It doesn't tell you a thing about anybody, right? Wouldn't it be nice to get some feel for what that person was really like? What was their life like? Or what were they interested in? Well, I can look at this first one and I can see he must have been handy. Maybe that was his occupation. I have to see carpentry, tools. He's got a guitar. He must have loved to play the guitar. Right away, I've got a different image about this person rather than just being some data on a page. Robert Axe loved sailing. This is also something that I see more and more where they're actually telling the reader of the stone what the person was like. So on the bottom it says that she was an artist and a quilter and a photographer. And so they're telling anybody who would ever get to look at this stone in the future something more about this person's life. Sometimes they may tell you things that you didn't know or maybe you didn't want to know. This one, I don't know if this person lost a bet or what, but if you read that bottom line, he was a pioneer, a publican, and a snob. So, what's he going to do about it now, right? This one I have no clue. Well, all I can tell you is that I found this one when I was going through them. I have no idea what this thing is. It's not an eternal flame. And it says on the top, it says, what did this cost? So in asking other people, the best we can come up with was, that's what he always said to everybody. What does this cost? What does that cost? What does this cost? And so they put something kind of strange on there with, what does this cost? But it's certainly something that starts a conversation. This came from a cemetery on Long Island. Notice the hammer and sickle. This is the International Workers' Organization, the Communist Party. These were people who joined up and fought in Spain in the 1930s in the Civil War. And what I like about the one on the right, on the bottom, it says, beloved husband and comrade. When we talk about where people are born and where they lived, we have to be very careful not to read something into the information that they give us. So on the left, it's got Leopold Goldsmith of Cleveland, Ohio. That doesn't mean he was born in Cleveland, Ohio. That means that's where he was probably from. And we don't want to make the assumption that he was born in Cleveland either. If you take a look at his wife, Laura Goldsmith, that says born in Cleveland, Ohio. And so I might key Cleveland on Leopold's record just as a town of interest, but not as a place of birth. So I'll still capture all the information, but I don't want to editorialize and I don't want to assume something that's not there. And I said husband and wife, and quite frankly, there's a real good chance that these two are husband and wife, but just because it's a joint stone does not mean that those two people are husband and wife. And if you look at the years of birth and they're very close, they could still be siblings, right? And you'll find markers with two men's names on it or two women's names on it, and they're probably siblings. So we don't want to assume anything when we're looking at these engravings. Unusual deaths sometimes get written on a stone. In this case, this was an individual struck by lightning. And this one was killed by an electric car, 1904. You might say, they had electric cars in 1904? Well, I went to Google and found out, yeah, they had electric cars back in 1904. So yeah, he could have been killed by an electric car. Somebody asked me in an earlier session about women's name. I keep talking about patronymic naming. Well, around the 70s, I started to find stones that had the woman's Hebrew name added to it as well. Now, I don't know if it's 100% purely halachic, based on law, but you found that during the 70s, during the women's movement, people started adding the woman's name, which I think is a really nice way to memorialize the mother as well. And so in this stone, at the end, it has not only the father's name, but it also says the mother's name on the stone. Unfortunately, what I'm finding is a lot more stones like this, with no Hebrew name on there at all. Some people have said that it's because it costs more to engrave them. I think the real reason is because they didn't know. Right? This is the person who's left that is going to give that information to a cutter. And now, thinking about the importance of these names and the linking of generations, all of that is lost with a stone like this. This was kind of interesting for me because I was trying to transliterate all the Hebrew names, and when I got to Jodi, I found the first name here in Hebrew was a Gimel, a Vav, a Dalet, and a Yud. And so I'm trying to figure out that's Godi, Godai. Well, that little apostrophe makes the G a J sound, and that's Jodi. So what they did is they transliterated backwards. They took an English name and they wrote it in Hebrew characters. And so sometimes, every now and then, you're trying to do this transliteration with names that make no sense to you, and you realize, oh, well, that's Adolf, or that's Jodi. In Australia, they have very different rules and concerns about privacy as they do here, at least what I've seen from stones that have been submitted. They will put down relatives' names, even down to grandchildren and great-grandchildren if they're alive. Whereas here, we're all concerned about anybody knowing anything about anybody that's still living. But if you take a look at this stone, you've got Samuel Franks, and his name there is Shmuel ben Yaakov, which is Samuel, and then Jacqueline Elizabeth Franks. But if you take a look at her Hebrew name, it's Jacqueline Elizabeth Franks. So it's translated from English to Hebrew letters. And remember, I told you can't tell anybody by a name. This is Barney O'Hara, and his name is JOWBR ben Avraham. Now, when I first saw it, I thought, oh, well, even his father was Jewish, he's Ben Abraham. It's probably somebody who converted. And when you convert, you're a son of Abraham. And so that's what you would see on a stone like that. But just looking at names, again, is going to throw you off. This was, I did a project in Albany. I'm a graduate of the State University of New York at Albany. And I've been working with the Judaic Studies group up there. And I've done a number of projects with some of their classes where I've gotten students to go out into the field and photograph and index headstones. And this was one of the projects where I told the students also, take some pictures of you doing the work so I can use it for an article. I had no idea they were going to take this picture. If you look at the stone behind this student, O'Leary, right? O'Leary with a Jewish star. Again, names mean nothing almost. But these are some of the quotes that came from those students, and I thought you might be interested. This was more than a school project that we would be graded on. The information we would be collecting and analyzing was going to one day help those who wanted to know more about their family and their ancestors. Genealogical research was never a field of study to which I paid much attention. I never thought of the importance of knowing about my own genealogical history, let alone that of others. However, after completing the readings and the lectures about genealogy and the role it plays in history, I realized that it's important to do this type of work. This is coming from students, which I thought was really great. It's a great way to give back to the community, and unlike other projects I've had to complete throughout my educational career, at no point did I feel as though it was a waste of time. There's a sense of satisfaction knowing that your efforts can affect others in a positive way by helping them and find their family history. And the last one, and I couldn't have written this one any better, it says, when I was growing up, my grandparents would tell me stories about when they were growing up and how they lived. They were able to tell me so much about their parents and showed me pictures of my great-grandparents. They even showed me the letters they wrote to each other before they got married. I realized that I'm very lucky to be able to know the history behind my family. The Genealogical project showed me that there are many people out there who do not always have someone there to tell them about their ancestry. Many people are essentially in the dark about who their grandparents are, and it keeps getting darker the further they try to track their family. And this is just another way to get this all permanent in a database for the future. Some strange stones that I've come across traveling through cemeteries and getting submissions by researchers. Notice Sam S. Solinsky. Notice the S's in Sam S. Solinsky. Is that gauche? They're dollar signs. Now Sam died in 1939. His wife, Isabel Solinsky, has plenty of S's in her name, but no dollar signs. Did Isabel spend it all? I don't know. Daniel Goldshire. One of the customs we have is that when you visit a stone, you put a pebble on the top to show that you've been there, right? There are lots of reasons why that's the custom. Everything from the idea of community, showing that you've been there, to the more practical, covering up burial ground so animals don't get into it. A lot of cultures have cairns or places where they put stones on burial grounds. But this was an interesting one I found on Long Island. This was from one of the Hamptons, and instead of putting stones, they used seashells. I thought that was nice. This was definitely with a genealogist in mind. They didn't know what the date of birth was, but at least they knew that this person was born in the 1800s. So they gave me the 1800s and they let me figure out the last 2 digits. It was very considerate of them. This one, sometimes it pays to wait. Right? Again, not everything that's on a stone is right. This one had this white on it. You can see the name Annie. Well, if you look closely, there was another name under it. It was Ellen. And they probably had the wrong name, and they found that it was a mistake, and they had them fix it, but they weren't going to pay for a whole nother stone to be made, and so this is what they did. This is a genealogist's nightmare. Take a look at the dates of birth and dates of death. We don't like this, right? Because we don't know, we know if we're living in the United States, maybe that 2/8 is February 8th, but if I'm living in Europe, that could very well be August 2nd. So we don't like to see stones like this. What you could do is, of course, figure out where the cemetery is and then figure that out. But if I'm doing a centralized database for people all over the world, I want to indicate dates by a 2-digit date, a 3-letter abbreviated month, and then a 4-digit year. This one, again, really just shows the linking. Unfortunately, this is a child who died in '85 in the middle, and on the left and on the right are the parents. So you've got Zev as the father, you've got Kayla as the mother, and in the middle is Avraham ben Zev veKayla. So you've got both parents shown in the Hebrew name, adding the mother's name. This one was just really poor planning, the way I saw it. Again, I'm trying to figure out the Hebrew names. So I found the bat, it's towards the end of the first row, and then after that is a yud and a shin, which is ish. But I know it's a woman because it says bat, so I don't know what kind of name that is. Ish, Yis, I don't know. Until you start going to the next row after a while, and it starts off with Ra'el. So then you realize that's Yisrael, it's one name, and it just didn't fit on one line, and that's why they got those 2 lines there to show that it goes on the second line. There was plenty of room, I don't know why, but this is the things that we're challenged with. These are my grandparents on my mother's side. I know it's a little hard to read, but the left side is Hyman Bialystok, and the right side is Rosa Bialystok. And I don't know, made them a little bit bigger. Notice that they're spelled differently. This is a husband and a wife in the same cemetery, in the same row, spelled differently. And nobody said anything. It's the same cutter. You can even see the style of the stones are the same, and yet one of them is wrong, right? So what does that mean about spelling on stones? But if this is a problem, maybe somebody can explain this one to me. I don't know how many of you have done templates or databases where you've actually put in data. You get a name like Friedman. How do you spell Friedman? Is it I-E? Is it E-I? I don't care which one it is, but pick one, right? Here you got a joint stone. One says E-I, the other one says I-E. And it's on the same stone. So you can't tell me the person didn't see that they were both there. But it doesn't only happen to English writing. Here's, in Hebrew, if you can read the top, it says Shmuel Yachak, right? It's obviously supposed to be Yitzchak. And on the bottom stone, you've got Yaakov ben Yitzchak, but it was a mistake. And this one, at least you can tell there was a letter missing. But there are some communities where maybe there wasn't a Jewish memorial stone cutter, and so somebody came in with something on a piece of paper and said, this is what I want on the stone. And by accident, the paper turns upside down, and you get weird things on stones because all they're doing is putting characters on the stone. And this is just an example of a mistake in Hebrew. Let me show you, this is another mistake, right? It'll take a while to look at it. You look at it and you see Joseph. until it gets pointed out to you that it's not spelt right. But it's not only just people that you never heard about. Ed Koch, mayor of New York, right? Everybody knows about Mayor Ed Koch. How am I doing? When he knew he was getting close to the end, picked out the place he wanted to be buried in Lower Manhattan. He wanted to be buried in Manhattan. He picked out the stone. He picked out what he wanted to have written on the stone. And when he died, there was a whole ceremony, and I don't know how many people were there, including press, and people took pictures. Can you read the date of birth? He wasn't born in 1942. He was a World War II veteran. It was 1924, and yet nobody did anything about that until it was pointed out to them. In this case, they replaced the stone. And I can only imagine that the cutter must have been really embarrassed and didn't want their name associated with there being a mistake, so they completely replaced it. Anybody see a problem with this stone? Now, I've heard of leap years. This is a super leap year, right? February 31st. This is a stone. The stone on the right is sitting in Germany. What's on the left is what is on the right, so it's just printed out. I'm putting this into a database. I'm going through this. This person was buried in Mount Gomorrah. I'm putting in Mount Gomorrah in the database, and I'm thinking to myself, who would live in a place called Mount Gomorrah? In fact, who would name a town Mount Gomorrah, right? What kind of a name is that for your town? Keep reading. Where's Mount Gomorrah? Stott, Alabama, in America. What's Mount Gomorrah? Montgomery, Alabama. Right? But it's on the stone. I know they lived in Mount Gomorrah. That's all, folks. This is a stone that's in the Israeli cemetery in Segula. Now, I don't know if this person may have been involved with the creation of the cell phone, right? It might have been one of the inventors, or one of the engineers that worked on it. He might have been killed by a bus while he was on the phone. I really don't know. But I thought this was kind of interesting. Some cemeteries are fairly strict about what they'll put in a cemetery. What kind of stones, whether they can be upright or they'll have to be flat stones, what can be on the stones themselves, and then some of them might have no rules at all. Now, I don't think that this is a real stone. My guess is that this is some work of a photoshopping, but this is a real stone. So you never know what you're going to find when you're walking through a cemetery. But the reason why we're doing this, here's an example. On the left is a picture of the stone that was taken in 2006 by somebody that went back to their ancestral town. And there's enough information there to be able to read it. We put it into the template, and we put it into the database. When he went back in 2013, that's what he found. Had that been the only picture he had, we would have lost the information. Again, whether it's acid rain, it doesn't look like this is personal destruction to the stone, but they are deteriorating, and if there's nobody maintaining them, that information will all be lost. So this is really the reason why we're doing this. The other thing I just want to mention is the Jewish Gen Memorial Plaque Project. The Memorial Plaque Project was started very similar to the JOWBR project, because if you think about a memorial plaque on the synagogue wall, it's like a little headstone, right? It's got the name of the person, hopefully it's got the Hebrew name, the patronymic name, it's got a date of death. And that information is the most important that we're looking for from a genealogical point of view. So we created another database that works just like JOWBR does. It was originally conceived by the Jewish Genealogical Society of Long Island, knowing that they did not have a database website. They gave it over to Jewish Gen in order for it to grow. I consider it just a companion database to JOWBR. And one of the reasons why it's so important to me to get this information is because I don't know about in your communities, but a lot of synagogues are going through mergers and closings. And I don't know where those things are going. A lot of them are being put in attics, or they're being sold. Recently, there was an article in the New York Times about a synagogue, an old synagogue in Chicago that was sold. They had a whole bunch of plaques on the walls. They tried to contact next of kin where they had information to give them the plaques. They didn't want them, but any of the ones that were not claimed, they melted them down for scrap metal. They didn't know what else to do with them. And so this database is another way of keeping alive the names of all of those people who were memorialized on the plaques. They come from all different types of people, very similar to what we talked about with the synagogues, with the JOWBR project. But this is an ideal project for anybody that has qualms about maybe going into a cemetery, or from a weather point of view, where you live, it's way too hot most of the year, and you don't want to go out there in the summer. Go into the synagogue. Take pictures of the plaques that are on the wall. Who could work on this, right? Well, not only could it be anybody in this room or the JGSs, Jewish Genealogical Societies, the synagogues, how about a bar or bat mitzvah class? Wouldn't it be great to let them work on something like this? If it's in Hebrew, the Hebrew is in block letters, let them use the Hebrew skills that they've been learning to create the database. So there are lots of possibilities for groups to get involved with doing these. Permanency is the most important thing that we're thinking of. And again, the information that's on here is genealogical, especially if it's got the patronymic name. The scope of the people memorialized is important, because you might think that if I go into a synagogue, all I'm going to find are names that are people from the congregation. That's not the case. There are lots of cases where people who are members of a congregation will buy plaques in memory of somebody who never even came to the United States. And I think it was Warren Blatt, the executive director for Jewish Gen, his great-grandfather's names were on the walls of a synagogue in Brooklyn that his grandparents put up. And without those plaques, he had no other source for that information. So there might be a lot more information in a synagogue than from that synagogue's local population. And here's just another example. If you start in the middle, you've got Chaim Goldblatt. His Hebrew name is obviously Chaim. Devorah Bela is the wife's name. And at the top is the daughter, Anne, whose name is Elka Chana Bat Chaim Halevi ve Devorah Bela, bringing together both parents in this case and in a patronymic way. So my challenge to all of you is to help us with JOWBR or with the memorial plaques. And whether you're members of a JGS, whether you'd like to do this and you're not a member and want to do it on your own, or approach a local JGS to start something up, we're happy to help you in any way possible to move along. We've got a bunch of representatives here from a number of societies that I know have made significant submissions to JOWBR and to the Memorial Plaques Project. And as I said, that's 3 million or 2.9 million records is all from people submitting records and from people that we've gone out to. But this is not wholesale done. This is all volunteer driven. There's nobody on here that's working on this that is paid anything. And so this is really our community creating something for our community. And at this point, I would be happy to take any questions. Oh, there's a microphone in the aisle if you want to ask your question.
I notice you have records from countries that don't use the Latin alphabet, like Egypt and India. Do you keep records, and are they searchable in the original alphabets or in transliteration only?
Yeah, JOWBR does have the ability of taking foreign characters, foreign alphabets in it. It gets a little more difficult when you're trying to search for those. So even for those that maybe come to us in Hebrew or Cyrillic, we will put that in a separate field and also transliterate it into Latin characters.
If I, as an individual, come up with about 12.5 pictures of grave sites, which I have of my wife's family, can I enter them into the JOWBR, or does it have to be by cemetery?
JOWBR rules require that we do a complete cemetery or cemetery section.
Yeah, like Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, I can't do that.
Okay, well, a section might be possible. And also you're telling me that's one of the cemeteries in Brooklyn, so it's Washington Cemetery or one of those. So doing a section is possible. But let's say you go and you go visit an ancestral town, and you can only get 20 of the stones, and maybe there are 40 there or 50 of them. I will take those, because the chances of somebody else going there to finish the job is a lot less probable. But if they're going to be United States cemeteries, then we do not just load up individuals' names. And the reason for that is when I showed you that list of all the cemeteries that are in there, I can't just say this section, you know, your family. So if I put the section on there, I want people to know that that's that section of that cemetery.
So it's possible that, that a cemetery or a section of a cemetery may have been submitted, but not completely, with odd bits and pieces.
It's possible, but it doesn't happen often, because people will ask me if they can do that, and I'll tell them no. I mean, if you want to get them in, just like mine, if I want to get my grandparents in, I did the section, and then I put up the whole section. So generally, we try and get that before anybody submits it. And I mean, it's in the rules, the ones that you guys all read. You know.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
I have two questions. One is in relationship to the cemetery in Salonika in Greece. I understand a couple of years ago, a lot of the tombstones were found in a farmer's field. And I was wondering if you knew anything about any work to try to recover names of the people on those tombstones. And then the other one is, I tried to access information about the cemetery in Aleppo through JOWBR. The thing is that no name came up, but I was curious whether it's possible to see all the names of the individuals in Aleppo, just in case that there's some error. I could not figure out how to do that.
Okay. So I'll do the second one first. All right. All right. So if you're looking for names in a town, especially if those names might not have been written in Latin letters, the best thing to do is do a town search instead of a name search. And if you put in Aleppo, you'll get records back. And you may find that the person who did the transliteration took names that might have been in Ladino, maybe, and they put that in the Hebrew name field. And so if you're searching for a given name or a surname, there's nothing there for them to find, because all of the work they did is in the Hebrew name field. So search by the location, and you might find what you're looking for.
So, I mean, I did look for Aleppo, but I couldn't find the name, again, because I don't know how to do.
Well, if you go to that main page,
Yeah.
and you do go to the pull-down menu and just do a town search for Aleppo, you should be able to get the records for Aleppo.
Okay, I'll try that again. See what
Okay.
happens.
And as far as the stones in Salonika, I don't know anything in particular about specific stones that were lost. I do know, I think for Salonika, there's a society in LA that partners with the people there, and they have an entire website presence because I think that's where I got the records from. They gave us permission to use them. Maybe they have added to theirs, I don't know.
Are they from the original cemetery or the new one?
I don't know for sure. I don't know. But it was a significant cemetery that they gave me records for, so I don't know if that indicates new or old to you, but try that. Yeah. Okay.
What about getting records from Israel on JOWBR? Why isn't it Israel included?
We do have records from Israel in JOWBR. Segula, where I showed you the phone, the flip phone, is from Israel. We've got contributions from volunteers in Israel. The Israel Society has been working on records themselves, and at this point, we don't have copies of the records they're working on. You know, whether that will change in the future, I don't know. But most of the stones that they have are Hebrew stones and need to be transliterated into Latin characters. So their database, I believe, is Hebrew searchable. But you can try the IGRA site, IGRA. That's the Israeli Genealogy Research Association.
And if someone died like in 2008 in Israel, would it be in JOWBR?
Only if somebody submitted an update. So when I showed you that listing of all the cemeteries, there was a date associated with every one of them. That's the last date that we got a submission. There are some places that are very good about sending us information every 6 months. There are some that are in there from 2000 or 2003, and we've got nothing since then.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you have any thoughts on how to approach cemeteries who, as a matter of policy, don't want their stones photographed, the most frequent reason I hear is a matter of privacy.
Yeah, carefully. I had the same problem. In fact, I had a situation where one of our members at the JGSLI at Long Island came to us and said, me and my brother administer this non-sectarian cemetery. Would you like to come in and take photos and whatever? I said, yeah, absolutely. And I came in and I started taking photos, and I'm working my way around the cemetery. And the landscapers, I guess, saw me doing that, called into the office, and before I knew it, the brother was out there saying, what are you doing? And I said, you know, your brother said I could do this. And he said, no, we don't want you to do that. By law, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to. Deceased persons don't have a right to privacy. There's nothing on that stone that indicates, other than maybe those Australian examples I gave you, there's nothing on there that indicates a living person. So there's nothing on there. It's out in the open. The gates are generally open to these cemeteries. You're allowed to do that. But am I going to stand there and argue with this guy and tell him that legally I know I'm right? You know, it's very difficult. The best thing you can do is try to explain to them why this information is so important. Maybe use that list I have on the site as to why we're doing this project. And then the more that do it, you can always say, well, you know, so-and-so didn't have a problem with that. And the same thing with memorial plaques. You know, synagogues will come back and they'll say, I have to refer this to the religious committee. Well, once I hear it's going to a committee, forget it, right? But you can't tell me that there's a right of privacy to the names that you have on the wall in the synagogue. You know, anybody could see them, right? In fact, they're up there so people can see them.
The other argument we've run into is cemeteries, private property. If we want to say you're trespassing, we can say you're trespassing.
Yeah, you know, if you ask a bunch of different attorneys, they'll give you different answers. But again, the legal right to do it doesn't necessarily mean that you can do it. Because if you're confronted by somebody at the cemetery and they ask you to leave, you know, I don't know what else you can do other than leave. So unfortunately, that's one of the challenges that we have. Thank you very much. I look forward to getting many, many submissions from you.